All right. Today, we are anticipating almost 200 attendants from around the world at our webinar, Mekong Dams, Debates, and Politics of Evidence. So welcome to you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Visa Visejindawat-Fink. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Michigan State University, Mekong Cultural Project, and I'm very happy to see you all here today for this panel discussion. And at the end of this webinar, we will have Dr. Peter Memorance. So friends of Dr. Peter, please stay with us later. And first of all, I would like to acknowledge the institutions that are co-organizing this webinar, which are Michigan State University, University of Hawaii, Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Center for Chinese Study, and the East-West Center. And the last one is Chiang Mai University, Regional Center for Social Science and Sustainable Development. On behalf of the organizers, we would like to send a special thanks of gratitude to the Lux Foundation for its support of our collaborations. And this webinar is the last of 4 in a broader series of the Mekong China Southeast Asian transitions. The first 3 webinars cover Mekong commodities, migration and mobilities, and the spiritual life of the Mekong. And today, we will build on the themes and momentum of these previous sessions in our discussion on the debates and politics of evidence or the Mekong Dams. It is my great pleasure and honor today to introduce you to all panelists from various organizations. We who have worked and live in the Mekong region, including Brian Eiler from Stimson Center, Dr. Carl Middleton from Chulalongkorn University, Dr. Vin Hieng Tui Phan from Graduate Institute Geneva, Dr. Paul Suvarnasang from Delhi University, last but not least, Kun Apichai Sanjinda as an independent development specialist. And as the way to begin, I would like to invite the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and talk about their work and interests with concern on the Mekong Dams. Brian Eiler, would you please go ahead for us?
Sure. Thank you, Kun Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone tonight to talk about dams and data and to, I guess, get deep into the political situation in the Mekong. I'm the director of the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program, and we work exclusively on Mekong-related issues to promote more sustainable pathways for development in the Mekong. We do many things. One of our theories of change is we believe that already too many dams are scheduled to be built in the Mekong region, and it might be the case that already too many are built. And this is driving the river system and the mightiness of the Mekong, as I call it, to a point of ecological no return. And we have to remember that the river is responsible for producing the world's largest inland fish catch. 20% of the world's freshwater fish come out of the Mekong Basin, and dams cut off those fish migration pathways as well as that fish catch. We'll get into that later. But we believe that there are ways forward. There are ways to link the power of the renewable energy transition, building out more solar, wind, and other forms of power generation, and smartly siting future hydropower and operating future hydropower in smarter ways that can conserve river resources and keep the Mekong mighty. But you got to make a link between that renewable energy transition and river resource conservation. As of late, our team has been very much involved with building out tools for stakeholders in the region to use to improve transparency, to provide decision support on infrastructure development. One of those tools is the Mekong Dam Monitor, which I hope we get to talk about tonight. This is an online platform that uses satellites and social media updates to provide near real-time and accurate reporting to vulnerable communities and governments along the Mekong River Basin in order to reduce the impacts of dams and to help those that are impacted by dams adapt. And I'm going to show you some data later from the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker, which is tracking and keeping pace of infrastructure development, as well as bringing in other forms of data to see how this infrastructure interacts with environmental data and social and risk data as well. We'll get into that later. Again, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. Looking forward to the discussion.
And I think next one is, please, Dr. Carl Middleton.
Thanks very much, Busa. So my name is Carl Middleton, and I'm the director of the Center for Social Development Studies in the Faculty of Political Science at Chulalongkorn University. Our center is also hosting a Center of Excellence in Resource Politics for Social Development with a focus on Southeast Asia. Aside from our research role, I'm also a lecturer and the deputy director on a graduate studies program in international development studies, and that's a MA and PhD program focused on this region. So a lot of my focus is really on issues, challenges, and opportunities of development in Southeast Asia. For my research, and I mean, a lot of my focus, I really focus on environmental politics in Southeast Asia, and especially on the political ecology of water and energy. I'm also very interested and focus on social movements and issues of environmental justice. I spent a lot of my time working on rivers, in particular the Mekong and the Salween. Recently, I've become also very keenly focused on to the ontological politics of rivers. So exploring the multiple meanings and values and using that as a way of thinking or reimagining futures of the rivers. And then lastly, I've also been very interested in trying to apply transdisciplinary research approaches as a way of really thinking in a more complex and connecting together issues on Mekong River politics. So thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion today.
Dr. Fan, please.
Thank you, Pisa. Good morning from Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. My name is Phan. My name is too long to pronounce it all, so you can just call me Phan. I'm currently working as an academic coordinator and head of the Southeast Asia region for the Executive Master of Development Policies and Practices of the Graduate Institute Geneva. As you may know, our program trains development practitioners who are working in the government, UN agencies, civil society, and private sector, covering a broad range of development issues from resource management, climate change, disaster, gender, labor, migration, rural development, public health, to public administration and governance. In the region, our priority countries are Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. To date, we have trained a total of 187 graduates who are holding important positions concerning sustainable development in the Mekong. It is very likely that you have worked with some of our former students if your area of interest is the Mekong. Besides teaching and supervising students of the program, I'm also doing research and consultancy in my field of expertise, climate change and water resources. That expertise was built through my years of working at the Mekong River Commission Secretariat in Vientiane, Laos, Asian Institute of Technology in its Bangkok campus, and in Vietnam, in the University of Twente, Netherlands. Before joining those international organizations, I was a civil servant. I was an engineer working on planning and designing hydropower projects in the south of Vietnam. So that is why I'm here with you. I'm very honored to be invited to this panel and looking forward to discuss with you all.
Thank you, Dr. Phan. Dr. Pon Suvarnasang, please.
Hi, my name is Pon Suvarnasang. I'm an assistant professor in the Global Studies Department at Bentley University, and currently also a Wilson China Fellow and Mansfield Luce Asia Scholar. I'm a political economist by training from London School of Economics. My work looks at the financialization of infrastructure. I'm interested in the politics of development finance, the political economy of energy infrastructure, corporate governance, and environmental conservation. I previously worked at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and the ASEAN Labor Secretariat. I guess to the extent that my family traces its history, I'm a fifth generation person of a family that has lived on off the Mekong River on the northern edges of Thailand and southern edges of Laos. So there's a personal and professional interest in water governance and the political ecology of the Mekong, as well as the Irrawaddy more recently. I conducted field work in Laos as a Fulbright scholar and spent a little over 2 years as part of a large interdisciplinary water, energy, food systems planning team as a former postdoc at the University of Manchester. And I'm looking forward to the exchanges and conversations that we'll have today, and hopefully that this will serve as a point of contact for the wider audience. Feel free to, of course, get in touch with me by email if there's anything that you'd like to follow up with today. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, and next one is Kun Apichai, please.
Hello, everyone from Bangkok. My name is Apichai. I have professional training in water resources. I have been working in this development cooperation arena particularly in Southeast Asia, and I've been observing the Mekong quite closely over these years. I'm now an independent expert, but doing work still on various different consultancies and projects in the region, Southeast Asia, and particularly on the Mekong. As I'm sure we would be touching on many of the issues and challenges, and maybe also some opportunities over this next hour or so. So I won't go into details on that. But other than to say that, back in 2019, there was the Mekong River Commission. They hold summits every, I think, 4 years. And the last one was held in Cambodia. And then they had a little bit of a contest of ideas, of just short sort of, maybe 2 or 3 sentences on what what one thinks of the Mekong. And of course, I also submitted mine on that occasion. And basically, I'm saying that the Mekong is Southeast Asia's major river, shared by 6 countries. It supports the diverse ecosystems and the livelihoods of millions of people within the basin. However, development activities have caused serious impacts on the sustainability of the river and environment, and that includes dams. And I just go back to the Mekong River Commission motto. Basically, their motto is meeting the needs and keeping the balance, which becomes extremely crucial now for the future survival of the Mekong. So with that, I look forward to a lively and fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for Thank you so much for your introduction. I think the next session that I think everyone is looking forward, right? We'll go to our panel discussion, and we have prepared 4 questions for this panel today. Yeah. Shall we go back to, the first question? Yeah. So the first question today is about drivers of dam construction on the Mekong River. And is dam construction a form of water grabbing? I think maybe first of all, I'm not sure. This is quite a Carl's expertise, right? Would you like to define what is Graham? Yeah, Graham. Would you like to define firstly what is water grabbing?
Maybe if I can start just with the drivers, and then I'll quickly comment on the grabbing.
Sure, yeah, that's great.
So, to start, we've already mentioned the word water governance many times in the introduction, in introducing ourselves, and I assumed that many of the listeners will think we will be discussing a lot about water governance today and the role of river basin organizations like the MRC. But to understand the drivers of dam construction, I think we actually need to turn to the political economy of the electricity industry, and especially the hydropower sector. So in terms of thinking, where do dams originate? If we start first formally, they have to be integrated into some form of electricity planning process. And in this region, this is a state-led process in each country, and it's also coordinated regionally in the form of cross-border power trade. And that coordination since the early 1990s was supported by the Asian Development Bank, as well as bilateral government-to-government discussions. So in terms of understanding the drivers for electricity planning, at least formally, each country has its own rules. And generally, electricity planning is seen as a technical issue, as a technical process of predicting future demand and then selecting projects to supply that demand. And that occurs either via bidding or in the form of state projects. So there's not really a formal electricity market in the region, but rather it's either by bidding for individual contracts or supplied by state. And perhaps also it's just briefly worth mentioning that some countries also have electricity regulatory authorities. But then if we think about the hydropower industry's interaction with that process, they can be very influential within the planning process. And sometimes the rules, the formal rules, are interpreted opaquely. So for example, the Xayaburi Dam, which is the first Mekong mainstream hydropower project that was constructed, was not actually included in Thailand's power development plan preceding its authorization. In other words, it was kind of put in just before the project was approved for the power purchase agreement, which is quite surprising given the size of the project. So then if we turn to the hydropower industry itself, like there's been a shift overall from state-led and built projects to a growing role for the private sector. And I think that's really important to appreciate. So most of the new projects in the lower basin nowadays are either constructed as public-private partnerships or purely by the private sector. Before the Asian financial crisis, many of the projects were Western companies, but nowadays the companies are primarily coming from Thailand, China, and Vietnam. And then for projects that were built even before this ongoing privatization process occurred, many of the state-owned enterprises have now been corporatized, and some of them even listed on stock exchanges. And the reason I want to mention this is that there's kind of been a shift then from dams seen as development, even if it's state-led development, to profit incentives within the hydropower industry. So I could talk even more about this. Just to very briefly turn to Visa's question on water grabbing. Is it a form of water grabbing? I mean, certainly hydropower projects, when they're constructed, entail the reallocation of the benefits from rivers, including impacts on ecosystems, forced displacement, and the degradation of resources both locally and further away. Some of the benefits accrue to the consumers of the electricity. It could be residential, commercial, or industrial. Most of the harms are within the river basin. I mean, there can be benefit sharing, but in general in Southeast Asia, for many of the projects that have been built, public participation is weak, forced resettlement is poorly conducted, especially in terms of livelihood recovery, and there's limited access to redress. So, I mean, we could unpack this a lot more, but I think others should speak. So it can be understood as a form of water grabbing, for sure. Thank you.
Any other thoughts for this, please?
I'll just, if I may, I'll just add on to what Carl's maybe introduced. Great. Okay. So Carl's mentioned a lot in terms of the hydropower industry, the role of energy planning agencies. The one thing that I guess two dual points that I would add to that are looking at the political economy of hydropower expansion. I got my start in the mid-2000s observing Asian Development Bank meetings with various agencies in Bangkok. And this has been a long process, right? The shift to public-private partnerships, began after the Cold War in the 1990s, specifically in the mainland Mekong region, and the World Bank and the ADB had a very large part in implementing those investment reforms as well as other forms of institutional legislation that laid the pathway, I would argue, after the 97 Asian financial crisis for what we're seeing today in terms of what Carl's mentioned. So intra-regional Asian investment has displaced both public and state and private commercial banks, as well as state-backed firms from such as Petro Energy from Vietnam and other quasi-state private firms. And so I would argue that the role of financial crises, as well as power sector reform, vertically and horizontally, first in Thailand, more recently in Vietnam, has created strong incentives for quasi-public-private entities to enter stock markets or capital markets. There are strong financial incentives to carry shares in these projects early on in the brownfield phase, and then offload them and make huge profits, large profits later on in the stage. So is my time up? I'll just give one last example if I have time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. But keep one there. And I think Brian raised his hand.
Okay, great. So one example that people might have on their mind more recently is, this ongoing Luang Prabang Dam. And if the Luang Prabang Dam, for me, as somebody who's been looking at this for, at least over 10 years, is a reiteration of the same pattern, right? What we see is CH Ganchang, it's large Thai construction conglomerate, buys shares from, so the primary investor is Vietnam Petro. They buy early. They are in cahoots with a Lao private firm, PT Seoul. Then they offload those shares as the project cycle moves. And then the buyer, of course, then becomes CH Ganchang and their subsidiary holding company, CK Power. And so the whole process, there are millions of dollars that are made, and this, they announced this to the Thai Stock Exchange late last autumn.
Excuse me,
This is a common pattern that I think hopefully we'll be able to get it more into as to why we've seen large exponential building of dams, despite more than three decades of grassroots movements against dams.
I think, sorry, Dr. Pro, I think we have to move on to the next question. But before that, how about we have Brian time for 1 minute before we move out? Yeah.
Sure. I just want to highlight some of my own observations and some things that folks tell me. And I think all of us in this event, and I talk to people in the Mekong or those that have been working in the Mekong for a really long time. And one thing that, the Mekong River Commission used to be populated by mostly expats, right? Mostly white men who were looking at resource conservation and planning in the Mekong. And I was approached by one of those gentlemen on a book tour at UC Berkeley 2 years ago, who came up to me and said, Brian, only 2 dams have been built on the mainstream of the Mekong in Laos, and 11 dams in China. But really what we couldn't believe is how many dams have been built on the tributaries of the Mekong over the last 10 years. And this is something that was very surprising to him. If I could just share a screen of what's happened over the last 20 years. You can see this, I believe you can see this map here. This is a picture of hydropower development in the Lower Mekong with China as well in 2000. So each dot is a dam. And the light blue lines is what we call a connected river system. So a fish or water would be able to pass through that part of the Mekong unimpeded. And the dark blue color is area that is cut off by a dam. So water, hydrological flows, as well as fish and sediment passage. Now, if we fast forward to the year 2000, actually to the present, we see a very different picture. We see nearly 100 dams built or under construction in Laos, scores of dams in the Central Highlands in Vietnam, all on tributaries, mostly on tributaries, and a lot of dams in China as well. In fact, we're missing irrigation dams. These are only hydropower projects. So the river system has really been cut off. And this is something that the pace of damming has been very, I guess, blindsiding to those even that watch it very closely. And I would argue that, I know we want to be brief here, but the process, particularly in Laos, has gotten out of control for damming the Mekong. So much so that the Lao regulators are selling off their utility company and selling off assets as well to foreign entities, not just dams themselves and building dams, but the agencies that should be regulating the river. So this is one thing that, and we can get into why that's gotten out of hand. But additionally, something else that's very surprising is the pace of alternatives, right? Disruptives that are changing the status quo. So when, please let me finish it, thank you. So when the country of Laos set off on its quest to be the battery of Southeast Asia, you know, I don't think anyone then could imagine Thailand and Vietnam opening up a lot of domestic power generation options in the future, particularly 20 years in the future. Lots of solar options, wind, and these things. And they're disrupting how dams are being built in Laos, but more importantly, the interest of these countries to buy power from Laos. So now with the system getting out of control, there are a lot of dams that are being built without markets for power development. And what's going to happen to them is something to think about during this talk and also to examine in the future.
Sure. Yeah, I think we will have time to talk about this more in the last question. Thank you. Yeah, I think we should keep moving to the second questions. So the second question is, what aspect of climate change, environmental, socio-economic impact should we be considering in debates about Mekong damming? And what are the opportunities and challenges of different energy trade-off in the Mekong region? Yeah. So what do you think about this? Yeah. Please.
Fisa, may I start?
Please, yeah, please.
Yeah. Linking to the picture that Brian has just shown, that there's a lot of dams on the mainstream and in the tributaries, I would like to echo that there are also a lot of studies has been conducted on the ecological and social and economic impacts of those Mekong dams. But the thing is, those studies have provided, in my opinion, mostly estimations or predictions with just a few evidences. Because of that, in my opinion, to ensure meaningful debate and decision making, we need to search for more impact evidences, especially in three areas which are not yet fully understood in the region. First, the geographical extent of the impact. Second, the cumulative impacts. And third, the climate change and hydropower relationship. Since we don't have time, let me focus on the climate change impact, which is very dear to my heart and my expertise. Climate change is one of the main threats for Mekong sustainable development. I think we need to seek a better understanding on the double relationship between hydropower and climate change. On one side, climate change, while changing the river discharges and water availability, will impact on electricity generation. Climate change, while increased climate variability, bringing more often and more intense storm surges that will threaten safety of dams. And you can imagine, in the worst case, when water are released to save a dam, a double disaster, or we often call a flood on top of a flood, is not avoidable for downstream people, for their lives and their properties. On the other side, hydropower is having its role in climate change mitigation and adaptation. The pro-dam groups promote that hydropower could contribute to avoidance of greenhouse gas emissions from coals, for example. Hydropower reservoir can act as a water storage buffer, an adaptation measure to mitigate the impact of flood and drought. The anti-group Anti-dam groups, however, promote a different picture of the dam. They argue that the dam's reservoir is a source of greenhouse gas emission itself. The negative ecological and socio-economic impacts of dam would increase the vulnerability of climate change of the affected community. In that case, contribution of hydropower to climate change mitigation and adaptation can become negative. I believe that the further considering of the geographical extent, cumulative impact and climate change will force us to revisit early claims of positive and negative impacts of a dam. Again, may appear to be a loss, and the cost of negotiation and decision making on dams may take change convincingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Fan. Yeah. And how about Paul? What do you think about energy source and the trade-off and drawbacks of it?
I think I'll let Kun Apachai go first.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry,
thank you.
I haven't seen your raise your hand.
Yeah, I think Dr. Fan has already, mentioned about the effects of climate change. I mean, if we think COVID is such already a terrible thing, many people are predicting that climate change may be even worse in terms of impact and devastation. So I think the sooner we get to grips with that, I think the more better off we are as a human, society or community. So I mean, okay, in relation to dams, I mean, the projection is that the climate, projections in this particular region in the Mekong, that is that eventually it will, with global warming, of course, the glaciers and, where the upstream parts of the river gets its water from, they will melt faster. So the hydrology of the river would, you will actually have probably more likely to have floods in the beginning. But then over time, it will taper off, all right? Because you just don't have that much snow or glacier left, just like the Arctic or Antarctic are melting. So in the end, then you probably have drier sort of, and in other words, less water. So if dams don't have water, then what's the use of the dams, right? It's as sensible as that. So if you keep on building that, then eventually you may just not have the full utility or even make things worse, as Dr. Fan has mentioned. So one really has to, as a decision planner or maker or planner, then you really have to, sort of forecast, at least 20, 30 years ahead in terms of what kind of scenarios are likely to happen over this region, over the period, over the area, and then really then come to a very conscientious decision of balancing, just like the MRC, yeah. Balancing keeping the needs and balancing, the requirements. Yeah, thank you.
Please allow me. So Brian, you raised your hand first. Yeah, please.
Sure. Just to continue off of Kun Apachai's points, thinking about climate change and the impacts on hydropower, turbines cannot run if there's no water there. And I think the Lower Saison 2 dam, which went operational in December of 2018, is an exemplary case study to look at for a dam that had a lot of promise behind it from the Cambodian government, but upon turning on the turbines, just did not perform. And why didn't it perform? The water wasn't there. The region has gone through 2 years of extended drought. So far, we're looking at this upcoming rainy season, the wet season. It looks to be wetter than normal, or at least wetter than the last 2 years, which is everyone's happy about. But from the point of those turbines turning on to the present, that dam has really been underperforming. So much so that I think that plus some other factors, like the Cambodian government is very much tuned into how the Tonle Sap is being impacted by all the things around it, climate change included, remembering that the fisheries of Cambodia are tied into the ecology of the Tonle Sap. All these things combined are causing the Cambodian government to really rethink large hydropower projects. One final point is just when Lower Saison 2 came online, it was supposed to solve all the country's electricity needs, at least in the short term. But for the first 6 months after its operations began, the country went through rolling blackouts. Phnom Penh had scheduled 6-hour rolling blackouts. So it just didn't live up to its promises. And I think that's part of the future of dams in the Mekong at large.
And I think we have 1 minute, one more minute for Pawn. Shall I go ahead?
I'll try to be extremely brief, but the first point I would say is from my experience of actually being on a water energy food nexus large scale modeling team, right? The point, so the question around evidence, the goal is to try to, they say, optimize synergies and mitigate risk. And so there's been discussion on this panel so far around scenarios, planning, and I would just give a word of caution that there's so much that can be planned for, but also, there are asymmetries of power, asymmetries of knowledge, and I'm very concerned in terms of the north-south, west-east divides in terms of the representation of mainland Southeast Asian nationals within these large interdisciplinary collaborations, and the way that they reinforce gender and ethnic power positionalities within some of these collaborations. But more so, the last point I would make is as opposed to just a green transition, every energy mix composition and recomposition, whether it's less fossil fuel, more solar, or any reduction or change in any kind of energy configuration involves a trade-off. If you have more solar, it involves all kinds of issues around land use, around all kinds of grid issues. There's a deeper discussion there around how governments see this and what baseload mentalities, as well as real investments, are made to perpetuate. You could decrease the last thing you could decrease hydro, increase solar, and on the last point around planning, you could have a lot of perverted outcomes or perverse outcomes, right? So increased coal use or fossil fuel, which is what we're seeing today in Vietnam and Cambodia and potentially Thailand later on.
Yeah, thank you. So we go to the next question. I know this is just only starters, right? So the next question is, with respect to the politics of evidence, what kinds of data about dams and the Mekong are shared, and by what entities and how, and what is model, how, and what is missing? How are claims of transparency and collaboration in data sharing made, and to what ends? So what do you think about this point? Oh, please go ahead, Dr. Fan.
Yes, I see that our discussion has been heated up just like global warming. So let me start to try to answer this first question by pulling you a little water to cool down. After all the discussion about scenarios, monitorings, and alternative, all of us seem to be aware of the values of data for monitoring, for predict further changes, for making analysis or propose alternatives. We can come to scenarios only if we have data. Otherwise, the scenarios has no meaning, because the basic concept of scenarios is plausible scenarios. It's not just any scenarios. So all of us are also aware that so far data in the region is not up to the needs. The data are insufficient in terms of categories, scales, and quality. Many impact assessments do not have a baseline. Many impact assessments can reach up to hydrological and ecological changes and cannot touch socio-economic changes meaningfully because lack of data. We all agree that trash in, trash out. Without data, statements are not evidence-based and often understood as provocative. Many out there. On one side, they may mislead the public On the other side, they are not very helpful for negotiations and decision making. Data sharing and transparency accordingly has been recognized as necessary for more informed decision making of dams. And call for data sharing and transparency is not just today. It has been happened around in 20, 30 years, but progress is slow. I may be wrong. I may be pessimistic, so I let my colleagues to add in. I think the reason for lack of data sharing are impeded in the policies and practice of the countries, the data custodians. When data are not freely shared among the governmental departments themselves, we cannot expect that they will be shared to independent researchers or international researchers. In that context, I think the data sharing and transparency issue may be continued for a while more.
Thank you. I'm not sure, Brian, would you like to talk about Mekong Dam monitoring data?
Sure. You know, the Mekong Dam Monitor is a platform that fills in the gaps. You know, we're not seeking to compete with any other bodies out there that are generating accurate data about the Mekong. But we're opening up the transparency aperture. And for the first time, using satellite imagery and validated data sources and methods, which are fully available, you could stare deeply into them on our website, to monitor levels of reservoirs all throughout the Mekong, all the mainstream reservoirs, the 11 in China, 2 in the downstream, as well as more than a dozen on tributaries. And we're really discovering a lot from this process. There's a lot that I could say about it, but we're seeing how the Chinese cascade is fully operationalized now, and it's producing a lot of hydropower. It's you know, unlike the Lower Sesan 2 dam, it's finally doing what it's supposed to be doing, what the Chinese say want it to do. And often that's done at the expense of the downstream, without any consideration to downstream impacts. And we saw that happening in 2019 when the cascade was finally operationalized. China was very excited to show off its new cascade that was finally ready and could produce a lot of power. But that happened at a time when the downstream was going through a major drought. And I think the data is very clear that the cascade was operationalized and the impacts downstream were quite disastrous. So we can look at some historical narratives within the monitor, as well as provide some very updated information. For example, yesterday, we notified about a 40 centimeter rise in the river that's still coming down the river from China and will hit Thailand in the afternoon on Thursday at Chiang Saet. And this gives locals time to adapt and prepare. And a lot to say. I'll wait for later.
That's very interesting. How about Panelist? You raised your hand. Yeah, you have some comment.
Yeah, I just, so as a scholar and a scientist, I sometimes take a bit of umbrage with the idea that, you know, the onus is on us to present yet even more and more evidence when the evidence has been presented, it's been collected for, as well as shared with activists and policymakers for quite some time. So I think that for the audience's sake, I think the first point is that there are many forms and processes of knowledge production, and the ways in which that evidence-based policymaking, which people hope will happen, is divorced from the actual political economy of dam building. So for example, I had an interview with Ministry of Energy of one of the lower Mekong countries some years ago. And I went in, I asked all these questions, presented all this evidence. The minister had right beside him a publicist that was paid for, that was on the payroll of a construction firm, which I will not name, right? And then they gave me a report back with, you know, evidence that I had already taken issue with and discussed with them. So there are discursive, forms of play there. And I guess the second point related to that I would make is that, to be careful about the weaponization of data discourses. And there is a resurgence of, I think, this language around data transparency. And I think baked into that, I think what also needs to be discussed again is what are the politics of data access? And particularly when we have large asymmetries between heavily large grant-funded projects, with large capabilities and graduate programs in North America and United Kingdom, vis-a-vis in Southeast Asia, and large incentives by these grant funders in OECD countries to then incentivize scholars to innovate by licensing some of these research products. Again, I think that there are strong incentives then for research projects to then be in cahoots or to try to gain local access by participating or collaborating with military figures, oligarchs, single party representatives, and other, non-democratic
so
players
very interesting.
within the region.
Yeah. And shall we give space to Carl?
Thanks very much. Let me just actually just to continue some of the themes that Pon was picking up on. I also agree that there's been a lot of emphasis over the last couple of years of data sharing. And in some ways, I also agree with Pan that there are still fragmentations of the way that data is shared even between state agencies. But I'd also just like to briefly put onto the table the sort of broader framing of what is the purpose of data sharing. State-to-state scientific data sharing is a quite narrow form of data sharing. It's important, but it's very, very foundational. And I think two things that I kind of flag as issues that need to be looked at more closely and acted upon. One is how that data sharing is actually connected to institutionalized mechanisms of accountability. So it's a step towards success that data is being shared, but that doesn't automatically translate into the accountability of project operation to communities that get affected by these changes in water. The second is that we've been doing research on the ground, finding that a lot of the information that's being shared state to state is either not in a form that's readily understandable by communities or simply doesn't reach them. There's separations between communities and local authorities that they connect to and the mechanisms of state data sharing. So in other words, the information is not actually reaching communities. And even if it does reach them, is it actionable? Like, does it help communities prepare or respond to the changing water levels?
It's
very rich information now, I think.
Lisa, if I could add, Kunapi Chai had a comment.
Oh, please.
Well,
we have a half-minute left.
Yeah, just a quick one. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, they're commissioning sort of a grassroots, study for the next probably around 6 months, of the later half of this year, looking at collecting data from the riparian residents that are living along the Mekong, especially in the 4 lower countries. So that may provide another sort of angle to the data, situation where it is actually coming from the ground. We have to watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Shall we move on to the next question?
Okay, I guess that's my kickoff. What I want to just tell you is, there are many different platforms. There are about more than a dozen, Mekong schemes. You can count, even in governmental to government or intergovernmental nature in the Mekong at the moment. But then there are various different permutations and and various different compositions. But from what I noticed among the so-called dozen, maybe about half of them, about six of them have actually water as part of their, cooperation framework. This is the one with the MRC, which is the Mekong River Commission. And then you have the the Lanchang Mekong, which is driven by China. You also have the Mekong Korea. You have also Mekong Japan. And then there's one that has a long name. It's called the Irrawaddy Chao Phraya Mekong Economic Cooperation Strategy, which is actually sort of driven by Thailand. And it also has a sort of an environment and water component there. So those are the sort of the 6 that does have water in it, all right? And so then the question is, and then, I guess nevertheless, inevitably it gets into geopolitics. China has its own called the Lanchang Mekong or Mekong Lanchang. But then the others are actually also very much involved, but which sort of in the other camp, except for MRC, which is a little bit of independent in that sense, all right? But then lately, I think ASEAN has also sort of got a little bit of a foot into the picture because they're saying the 5 of the lower riparians are all ASEAN member states, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So why doesn't ASEAN get involved a little bit more? Actually, last year when Vietnam was chairing ASEAN, the leaders, up to the leaders, they actually mentioned about having an eye on the Mekong sub-region, okay? Because very much this is part of the mainland Southeast Asia of ASEAN. And so they're saying that maybe there should be a little bit of more closer alignment between these two, the Mekong and the ASEAN agenda. But interestingly, there was a survey done by the Institute for Southeast Asian Study, ICS in Singapore, last year, looking at the survey. They do a survey every year on Southeast Asia. And this question was asked to about over 1,000 respondents. Basically, what do they think about ASEAN taking interest or having it on the agenda? And okay, by and large, the response was yes, I think they should. But then when they ask, okay, what about the existing mechanism? They say, well, they prefer to use existing mechanisms rather than to create any more, all right? So in that sense, then there's actually a lot of platforms, a lot of interests, but sometimes they are competing, sometimes they are duplicating. And so what is really needed, I think, is that we really need to have some inclusive, sort of balanced representation. I mean, inclusive meaning not just the government's talking. We have to bring in the private sector. We also need to bring in the civil society and the local communities and so forth. And I think this is where it's missing, all right? But then it's a bit complicated too, as we all know, the geopolitics of the sub-region and the geopolitics of Southeast Asia, and also not to mention the different sectors that are also competing, whether it's energy, water, food, or what, So anyway, I think I'll stop there. I think my other friends could maybe comment a little bit more on this. Thank you.
Yeah, please feel free to jump in. Yeah, Carl.
Shall I add a comment? So I think I could just pick up a little bit on what Kunapachai has already mentioned. I mean, there is definitely a tension over defining the mandate to plan and govern on the Mekong at present. And I would say that if we were to focus in onto 2 particular organizations, it would be the Mekong River Commission and the Lanchang Mekong Cooperation. But I would really avoid oversimplistic debates of conflict or cooperation, but rather emphasize that it's simultaneously happening at the same time. Like there is degrees of tension or competition and conflict in some ways, and then also cooperation simultaneously across multiple issues. So navigation, hydropower, water quality, and so on. And I think one of the questions that we actually need to ask is who is cooperating with who and who is excluded? So actually kind of think about it in that way. And I mean, my overall observation is that I think states are probably cooperating more now than they have in the past, especially in terms of China with the downstream countries. Compared to the early 2000s and the 1990s, where China essentially went ahead unilaterally with its projects. Nowadays, there's a lot more state-to-state cooperation, but as Kunapachai has flagged, actually those that are maybe more excluded, I think, are especially civil society and the communities. There's a growing discourse around water diplomacy that I really see as being defined as state-to-state diplomacy. And as that kind of gains momentum, it kind of is playing down a bit the spaces for public participation. So, I mean, there's other things that I would like to add, but I think I'll leave space for others to comment. Thank you.
Kun Apichai would like to respond to Carl first, or otherwise Brian should go ahead.
Let others go. Yeah.
Yeah, Brian.
I want to note that over the last year, China has doubled down on its pledges to be more transparent. Now, that doesn't mean a lot, but there have been steps taken from Beijing to share more information with the Mekong River Commission as well as with the public. So for the first time ever in November, a new data platform opened that gives hourly river levels below the Jinghong Dam in China. And we can see how that dam, we bring in the Mekong Dam Monitor. The Dam Monitor and the Chinese portal really go well together to help understand with what's happening on the river. You can see how that dam is just delivering these shocks to the river system, particularly in the dry season. And again, the monitor can corroborate that. And I mean, this is something that locals have been talking about for decades, but now that the data is there, there's a lot for others to latch onto and to, you know, bring to the media for discussion or bring to their governments for discussion. And I think that I agree with Carl that one, the state-to-state cooperation is increasing, data provision is getting better. The question is to what end, and then to what degree can more stakeholders be part of that process now that collaboration is indeed deepening? It's something that needs to be enhanced.
Right, yeah. Kun Apichai,
Okay, if nobody else wants to take. I mean, just to go back, yeah. Just now, when we talk about ASEAN, you know, the dams and things like that. You know, Laos has already an explicit policy of being a battery of Southeast Asia, right? And I think in their minds, what they're talking about is using hydropower, which of course they have a lot of potential on that one. But then, as other commentators have said, you know, it's, you know, they can also have other renewable energy besides hydro, like solar, wind, and so forth. But interestingly, like the Saibury Dam, the first one that's in the lower mainstream, is actually a Thai investment. All right, basically it's a Thai project, but sort of, you know, located in Laos. The Don Sahong Dam, which is the second one, is actually a Malaysian investment. All right, and then Dr. Pon has mentioned that Luang Prabang Dam has some Vietnamese investment, right? Petro Vietnam or whatever. So you're getting a more ASEAN flavor in the dam construction business in Laos. And then the fact is also linked to the fact that Laos has now also plans, you know, they are part of ASEAN, so they are part of the power grid. There's an energy trade system existing within ASEAN. And what Laos is trying to do is export its energy to its neighbors, basically to Thailand, Vietnam being the closest, and then later on to Malaysia or even Singapore. Yeah, so that's the energy connection with ASEAN. Thank you.
Yapon, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I would just add on to what my previous colleagues have said, and particularly Kun Apichai. You know, the language around the battery of Asia was developed and coined. The positionality and the view of Laos as this battery within this larger economic market and space was developed, you know, around the ADB and this larger idea that Japan would lead a value chain around that. But this sort of upstream downstream narrative, the role of China and the role of, you know, lower Mekong states, as Kun Apichai was mentioning, what we're seeing again after 97 and after the 2008 financial crisis and onwards is more, I would call it an upstream mentality by downstream states. So, you know, Vietnam, Cambodia are interesting contradictions, right? They are both, when you look at the climate data or rainfall data or, you know, agricultural data, they're affected by drought. They're likely to be affected by water stress, and yet there are also Vietnam is also investing in dams. Cambodia would like to build more. When you look at their power development plans, they are planning on buying hydropower. They're planning on buying hydropower from Laos. So it's not an entirely upstream downstream dynamic, but as Carla was saying, there are bilateral competition and forms of cooperation happening within Lower Mekong states too.
Yeah, Carl, please go ahead. I think we have half minute for you.
I just wanted to maybe underscore one of the reasons why it's important to have diverse discussions about different regional visions of the Mekong Basin, that when it becomes mainly defined by state-to-state water diplomacy, I actually think the states largely have a fairly shared understanding of the role of the river in development, which is primarily economic development. And there are different shades of green economy, but I think the kind of main narrative nowadays is ecological modernization or green economy around the river. But knowing many of the other voices within the basin and different visions, different community practices, civil society movements, there are other different possible futures for the Mekong. And so the reason why I think it's important to widen out the debate and make sure that there's space for that discussion is so that there can be discussions about what should the future of the river be. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Fan, I think half a minute, and then we will move on to the question and answer.
Yeah, I just catch on some of the other ideas that other colleagues have thrown out. First is on cooperation. I think that we should have to look into the nature of that cooperation, right? Because sometimes there's an activities, but actually it's only one side driven. It's not real cooperation. Secondly, on the notion of green economy, green policy, then we also have to look at the inside of the policy. The title can be green, but inside is infrastructures and sometimes it's brown, it's not green. Just a notice.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, and Paul, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, just one last thing to add on to what
Sure.
Carl just said before we move on to Q&A, around the issue of public participation. And I think the difference is, right, we're seeing new forms of public protest against dams. Fair Finance, for example, anchored to a number of NGOs, but also Oxfam is a reiteration of this. But they're really different. There were very strong movements all through the 90s and early 2000s, and there were, in the context of globalization, they were outwardly looking for accountability from external agencies. And today, given the decline of democracy and the rise of coups, military regimes all over mainland Southeast Asia, there are different spaces and there are different modalities of trying to find accountability and also space in these discussions that I think also needs to be, to be embedded within these larger discussions about scenario planning and planning. What does it look like to try to find accountability in the context of coups, military juntas, single party regimes that own all the land? So the forms of civil resistance today are very different than they were 20 years ago.
Yeah, that is excellent. Yeah, that's very rich discussion. And yeah, I think time is ticking. We have to keep moving on. So the first question is, I think, go to Brian. So it's talking about a map of Mekong Dam suggests a centrality of Cambodia in protecting the downstream Mekong. Should we focus our attention on limiting dam construction now in Cambodia over other countries? Why or why not? Would you like to show your map as well?
Right. Well, I probably won't go back to my map, but when I teach about the Mekong, I often talk about how, I want to note that anyone can answer this question. The headwaters of the river rise in the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau, but the real life, the beating heart of the Mekong comes from the Tonle Sap, and the Tonle Sap Lake is the unique feature, one of the unique features, but the most unique feature, I will argue, of the Mekong system, insofar as it receives water from the mainstream during the wet season, and then lets that water out during the dry season, kind of a beating heartbeat right? And that heartbeat brings in fish larvae and fish eggs and juvenile fish. And when they get in there, it's quite complicated, but they find this very nutritious mix that allows them to grow large and many and big. And then when the contraction happens, they travel out. Many are caught in Cambodia. Some take a right turn down to the delta in Vietnam. The other take a left turn upstream for spawning. And this is what feeds the Mekong. This is one of the things that makes the Mekong mighty. So I often emphasize the need to conserve the ecology of the Tonle Sap and that natural pulse and heartbeat of the Tonle Sap. Upstream dam regulation is hurting that heartbeat. It's really putting it on a life support. And we're seeing that heartbeat becoming less robust in terms of how long the expansion lasts and then the contraction comes back down. It's happening in a much shorter increment, and it's happening at different times of the year in different ways. Okay. So dams and climate change are causing this. There's not a lot we can do about climate change impacts, but there is a lot that hopefully we can do about the way that dams are impacting the Tonle Sap. Yeah.
I'm really not sure. Carl, do you have any additional thought on this?
Maybe just one very brief one. I think, as the way that Brian has already framed the contribution of Cambodia to the ecological vitality of the basin, this actually also places agency in Cambodia to actually promote a different vision for the Mekong if it would choose to do so. So rather than just seeing Cambodia as the downstream victim of upstream dam construction, the debate could totally be reframed and say, well, if Cambodia showed more leadership in protecting Tonle Sap and the floodplains and demonstrating the values and benefits that it generates, not just for Cambodia, but for the Vietnam Delta downstream, for the fisheries of the wider basin, then I think there could be even some leadership that could come from Cambodia to say, look, this is a different way of thinking about the value of the Mekong, both for Cambodia and the wider region. So it could actually change the narrative quite significantly looking at it that way. There are obvious reasons why that may or may not happen, but I think there are opportunities there. Thank you.
Kunapishai, please.
Well, just to follow on to that, I thought Cambodia government has put a moratorium on their 2 dams that are in the mainstream, right? Because Cambodia also have the 2 dams, right? Stung Treng and Sambo. And then they say, all right, we'll put a 10-year moratorium for whatever reason. I don't know what the real reason behind it, but at least they're showing some leadership perhaps to say, look, there are some options or alternatives to it. I guess the other thing is, if you really want to think outside the box, many of the Western countries, whether US or Europe, they are decommissioning dams, right? They're taking away dams that they have already been built. So, but of course, I don't see that happening in the Southeast Asia or Mekong in the near future. But maybe we should think about that in the, at least in the midterm to, the longer term, when you don't have any water left, like what we were talking about earlier, right? Anyway, food for thought. Thank you.
Yeah. So the second question is, what are the primary differences between Western and intra-Asian development of dams after the 1997 shift that Dr. Prawn mentioned in the first question, and what might this mean for the current and future trajectories of dam development? Also, what standards are there for EIA on these dams, and where can one find this? Okay.
I guess I'll go first because my name. Sorry.
Yeah. Either way, yeah. Okay, yeah. Maybe Point go first, and then.
Sorry,
Fan?
No, Dr. Fan.
Yeah.
No, you can go first. It's just our name are similar, so I don't know which are Pon or Fan. I will answer the second part of the question regarding what the standards of EIAs are there for the dams. So in principle, the EIAs are follow the standards of the host country, mean the national laws and regulation regarding EIA. In addition, is follow on the safeguard principles that the investors have to follow. Like if this is ADB, then it is ADB social and environmental safeguards. the Mekong River Commission have took a long time to discuss and about a transboundary EIA standard. Yes, it has ended up in 2017 or 18, I don't remember exactly, a guidelines for conducting transboundary EIA, but it's just a guideline, it's not compulsory. So investors and the host country can refer to that transboundary EIA guideline for assessing the dams. Thank you.
Paul, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, so the question, I think, was, what are the primary differences? So when the ADB and the World Bank, so the World Bank took a moratorium on hydropower lending after, serious fallouts in India and Brazil. So it reintroduced itself to hydropower lending in the case of Laos and the Nam Tun 2 project. And because it had that vested interest in re-entering the global hydro lending market, it really tried to set the bar high in terms of all these environmental standards. What that ended up doing was, when the shift happened to, the Lao government and also other mainland Mekong Southeast Asian governments preferring contracts with Thai commercial banks, Vietnamese firms, for example, is those banks are not, one, they don't abide by OECD principles. The governments themselves are not interested in trying to adhere to, this is covered in some of my ethnographic research. They've actually said, it's too high, we're not interested, it'll take us 10, 20 years to go through the EIA. Our job is to try to meet the plan and churn out these dams in 3 to 5 years. So they are purposely short routing and compressing the time frame for both building and financing by going with intra-Asian lenders around. So I think there was this backlash, both in terms of what, Western lending engagement and the strings that came along with that, as well as, of course, an increase in provisional lending by intra-Asian firms.
Thank you. Dr. Fan, would you like, you raised your hand, right? Or from the previous one?
Sorry, I will be short.
Sorry, no, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. In addition to what Paul explained about the difference between the development of dams after 1997, I would like to mention that this is the existence of the World Commission on Dams report in 2000, and that provides a better picture and more comprehensive picture about both the positive and negative effects of the dams, with driven a change in the thought and methods regarding dams. That report is very important.
Okay, Carl and then Brian. Yeah.
Wanted to thank you, Risa. I just wanted to briefly add a little onto the role of environmental impact assessments. I mean, globally, this has been seen as an example of good practice. To do a study about what the environmental impacts could be, and then how could they be mitigated, avoided, or should the project even go ahead. I think the challenge in Southeast Asia has been several-fold. On the one hand, it's positive that nowadays every country in mainland Southeast Asia has a law on environmental impact assessment. That is a good thing. But there are also some challenges at the same time. They often come quite late in the planning process, where essentially there is already a momentum around the project to proceed. So the degree to which they can influence whether a project fundamentally goes ahead or not is often, it's difficult to say that an EIA would stop a project. It may just modify it a bit. A second challenge is the quality of the EIAs. There's been a number of examples recently about Northern Lao mainstream projects being proposed, where literally EIAs have been cut and paste from one project to the next. So they're not tailored to specific projects. And that kind of reflects on the quality and seriousness of how EIAs are being considered. The third thing, which I think is also really important, is these EIAs are supposed to anticipate and mitigate impacts, but do they actually in the end get operationalized in the way that they're intended? So in other words, there's far less actual operationalization in terms of an environmental management plan that works on the ground once projects are being operated. And I think even for Xayaburi Dam, which is the first project on the mainstream, this is really important, where mitigation measures have been put in place, but there's not actually information in the public domain about their effectiveness. So I think all of this points towards accountability process, public participation in decision-making processes around projects. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate Carl's point on accountability, because a lot has been studied about, say, the fisheries ladders on the Xayaburi Dam. There are fish ladders on the Lower Saison 2 Dam, Don Sahong as well. But there's been, as far as I've seen, zero public dissemination of any research about the effectiveness of those mitigation efforts, and it makes you wonder why. The one point I wanted to make was that if we think about Laos's Battery of Southeast Asia plan, that's kind of like a marquee statement that this is what the country of Laos is going to do over the next decades to develop its economy. But if you asked a planner, maybe even 5 years ago, how many dams are necessary to become the Battery of Southeast Asia, how much power needs to be produced, or how much income will satisfy the requirement of being the Battery of Southeast Asia, there was no answer to that question available. So no one knew or knows how many dams will be built in the end. That's a problem, right? You cannot plan, you cannot know what the final environmental impacts are. You don't know how to offset with so much uncertainty into the future. And this project by project approach to development has really created a huge mess, particularly in the country of Laos. And I think over the next 15 years or longer, the rest of the time is going to be about cleaning up that mess. So unfortunate days ahead, I'm afraid. But that project by project approach to development, rather than thinking of a basin-wide planning approach or a more optimized trade-offs approach that we've been discussing earlier, again, has really gotten Laos into a bind.
Yeah. Kuna Pichai, please.
Maybe sort of a back to ASEAN kind of thing. Back in 2013, the ASEAN leaders met in Brunei, because Brunei was chairing ASEAN at that time. And basically they came up with one of the statements that they actually made in their chairman's statement was that it's as follows, yeah? Read it to you. We recognize the importance of preserving, managing, and sustaining use of water resources and call on ASEAN member states to continue effectively implementing the ASEAN Strategic Action Plan on Water Resource Management, including, and this is the important part, assessing impacts that economic development has on the environment and people's livelihoods in major river basins, including the Lower Mekong Basin. So it's not as if even the ASEAN leaders have not taken note of this. But somehow, because it's got buried, or there's so many issues that ASEAN works on, and nobody is following up except people like myself, which keeps on reminding, well, the leaders have spoken, so why don't you take up action and try to make them accountable or something? And interestingly, who is chairing ASEAN this year? Brunei. So maybe it's time to revisit this and say, hey, you made a statement back then. Where's happening now? Okay, thank you.
Additional thought on, and then we will move on to the last question. Yeah.
Yeah, just the last point on the EIAs, on the environmental impact assessments. This is a point that I've been trying to harp on for the last year or so, and hopefully we'll keep working. There isn't enough corporate social governance coming from either ASEAN and or extra regional bodies, right? So commercial banks, particularly intra-Asian commercial banks that invest in hydropower projects in Laos and elsewhere, they're not signed on to the Equator Principles, for example. And another example of a situation that's happening right now is we have activists in the region, all across the media, dissenting to the Luang Prabang Dam. The construction firm that built the Xayaburi Dam has a 10% stake in the Luang Prabang Power Company. It issued a statement to the Thai Stock Exchange last November, I believe, or October, stating that they were pretty confident, in its financial disclosure, because they had to rearrange their shares. It was pretty confident that the EIA would be passed by mid-2021. So for a construction firm and a 10% stakeholder in the power company that is leading the project to be that confident to declare to the Thai Stock Exchange Commission that it was pretty much in the bag that the EIA is likely to be passed, it tells you enough, or at least tells me, or should tell us enough about corporate social governance that's needed, as well as collusion between state bodies and the private sector.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Yeah. So we move on to the next question. I think will be our last question for today. So this discussion on new forms of social movement is fascinating. Can you expand upon how civil resistance is different now than before, and how are publics mobilizing under various military or authoritarian regime in the region? Who would like to respond to this? Yeah, please, Carl. And Paul.
Hey, thank you very much. Sorry, it's raining here. Hopefully it's not too noisy. So I mean, I think some of the activities have been the same. It depends country by country, because some have more space, some have freer media than others. But some of the movements, like organizing community meetings, issuing declarations, are reasonably similar to before. As Pon mentioned, there have been kind of new strategies, for example, the use of the courts, targeting the OECD guidelines on multinational corporations. I think social media has become very important as a new arena of discussion and debate. One of the challenges at the time of COVID has been actually having physical meeting and networking across the region is difficult. And maybe I'll comment on this more in my final comments. But I mean, I think transparency and accountability is maybe closing somewhat as the regimes become more authoritarian, and it's definitely a challenge. Thank you.
Yeah, Pon and Fan, and I think we have to be in
Dr.
time.
Fan,
yeah.
Dr. Fan, you can go first. You had your hand raised.
I'm not going to answer the question about how it's different between now and before, because I think that the politics of participation have been changing all the time. It's a dynamic process, so you will see that civil society will be in this form today, and then the other form tomorrow. And as Khan said, it's very much depending on the space of cooperation allowed in the country, following their rules and law and regulation. There's another more interesting question for me, is whether the participation of the civil society is effective, or social movement is effective or not to influence the decision of the dams. So whether a social movement can lead to the change of the course of the decision or not, whether they participate or not may not be like the visual, the visibility of the participation is not as important as it can run underground, but it's behind the scene, but it is influential. Thank you.
I think so. Pon, would you like Kun Apichai go first, or you would like to?
Sure, Kun Apichai, go ahead.
Okay, on social movements, I can just say that in Thailand, at least, there's the Mekong actually borders a little part of northern Thailand where it comes down, and then most of it later on in the northeast part of Thailand. So there's a lot of active civil society organizations, especially in the northeast, that they have formed what they call Mekong's People Forum together with the northern brothers and sisters. So I think let's see how that what eventuates from that, because they are certainly pushing their some of the civil society agenda on the Mekong. Thank you.
Thank you. We have only 1 minute left. Yeah.
Okay, I'll be really brief. Again, as I was saying before, earlier forms of dam discourse, dam protest was around, dam-induced displacement. It was geared towards large institutions, banks, and whatnot. And what I would at least like to remind people who may or may not be in the region is, the Economist, I think a month or two ago had.
Excuse me, Paul. In terms of closing, would you like to continue your thought on this, and then we pass to other panelists for this?
Sure. So just to finish my point, which I guess will also be my closing remarks, The Economist had, an article about a front page story in which the cover was about the Southeast Asia essentially being a site of contestation between the United States and China. And to the extent that Mekong Southeast Asia becomes relevant on the world stage, again, I hope that also includes support for civilians, democracy protests that are very mowed down and driven down by multiple fronts, right? Pro-democracy protests, land confiscation, all of these different things that in the past, there were very strong issue-focused things around dam displacement, but now activists are spread thin in a number of places. Courts are being used in Thailand, but again, in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, to some extent in Myanmar, where the state still controls de facto ownership of land. The ways in which protests and foot dragging play out are very different.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and I think we all have 1 minute left to tell audience to think about moving forward. Yeah, as a concluding remark. Yeah. Kun Apishai, would you like to go first?
Well, okay. I mean, it has been a very enriching and I think fruitful exchange. I hope the audience has also sort of enjoyed and have some food for thought there. I think going forward, basically we need more multi-stakeholder platform, more inclusive, meaning not just governments talking, but civil society, private. And I think we need to bring people to the table. But then as the challenge, as I posed earlier, is that sometimes it's rather difficult under the current, shall we say, environment, political, social, economic, whatever, especially in mainland Southeast Asia. But there are, for example, ICRC is doing this, sort of a grassroots, study, which would hopefully shed some light. And then maybe others should pick up on that. Okay. So hopefully we will, I don't have any answers of how to have this, because we are pressured on many sides by the sectors themselves, by the hierarchy of the societies and and the community in the region, and also by international contestation. You cannot ignore the big rivalry. The powers or even middle powers are also involved. So how to balance meeting the needs and keeping the balance, that is indeed a very important thing to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Fan?
Thank you, Frisa. I'm quite boring, so I will just mention 2 suggestions at the end of the talk. First of all, as we will see that we have lack of data, we lack of evidence. So I would like to suggest that first, we need to have a review and systemize of the existing evidence. I talk about evidence and not estimation or prediction of impacts of the Mekong dams, tributaries, and mainstream, and disseminate the information like Brian said before. There are so many studies, but they're not disseminated to interested persons and public. Second, we need to improve risk assessment, talking about climate change uncertainties and scenarios and economic development uncertainties and scenarios, and improve management of dams, also with consideration of climate change. Thank you.
So Carl and Brian.
Maybe I hope you can hear me over the rain. I'd like to, I think, emphasize the importance of creating actionable knowledge. I really appreciate the focus of this discussion on the politics of knowledge and knowledge production. I think we need to ask the really important question of how does knowledge actually turn into action? And in my opinion, I think it relates to the way that knowledge is created, and we have to really be talking about knowledge co-production. So evidence generation that is created through different actors that are involved producing it together, engaging in dialogue and discussion. And I think this takes place in multiple ways. It can be state-to-state knowledge cooperation and production, but also there are multiple research networks across the region that should continue to be active, even though it's more challenging with COVID. And ultimately, I think there needs to be multiple arenas of discussion and debate to deliberate all of this knowledge. I think polarity is really important here. If I was to say one short-term priority and one long-term priority, short-term priority, I think, has to be to move from the focus on water data sharing, which is important, to focusing the discussion on to how that links to accountability for the impacts that are occurring and how to address them, how to act on them. In the longer term, I think there needs to be a revived discussion about the future of the Mekong River that really takes seriously the diverse visions and values beyond the green economic growth paradigm that is dominant at the moment. And I think that has to take place again respectfully and basin-wide. Thank you.
And 1 minute for me, because I know we want to wrap up. 4 things to watch on the Mekong. One is that through the Mekong Dam Monitor, we've discovered that there's still half of the active storage available in China's upstream cascade that, if history repeats itself in the next couple months, will all come downstream. The mainstream level is rising right now. That's not normal for a dry season. It's actually abnormally high right now. More water is going to come downstream. That's something to watch. 2, the Lower Mekong Dam, there has been some discussion on this. There's still a lot that has to come together to make that dam construction start. One of them is a power purchase agreement from a buyer of power from that dam. Currently, without one, that dam will not begin construction. Something to watch. 3, Lao Ministry of Energy and Mines has new leadership. Will new leadership bring new vision to the Battery of Southeast Asia? Something to watch. 4, Vietnam's Power Development Plan 8 has plans for import of more power from Laos through the Battery of Southeast Asia. How will that power be composed? Will that be all hydropower? Will it be some solar and wind? So some interesting things to watch going forward. And I want to thank you all for inviting me to this discussion.
That is so great. I think we wish have more time on this. Yes, and I think I would like to thank the panelists for these valuable contributions toward our understanding of the Mekong dams today, and also thank to those who work behind the scenes to make this possible. And I think we reached at the end of our webinar. I think for myself as Mekong citizen, I hope today will bring us a little closer to resolving issues around dams on the Mekong. Yeah. Thank you for joining us today. Yeah, and perhaps see you next time.
Thank you, Dr. Fink, and thank you to all the panelists and the co-organizers for putting on this incredible and informative and rich conversation. Jamin, do you have the slide to pull? So I'm Amanda Flame. I am a professor at James Madison College at Michigan State University and one of the co-organizers of the series. And in closing this final webinar, we want to take a brief moment to remember Dr. Heather Peters, who was tragically killed in an accident last weekend. Dr. Peters was an archaeologist and a cultural anthropologist who worked in Southeast Asia and China for over 4 decades on issues of environmental injustice as it pertains to the marginalization of ethnic minority and indigenous peoples in particular. Some of you may remember that she participated in our second webinar on Mekong mobilities. where she drew on her remarkable expertise to raise critical concerns regarding the cultural dislocations that result from dam-induced displacements in the region. And at the time of her passing, she was leading an international and interdisciplinary team to assess the political ecological impacts of the Luang Prabang Dam. And the work continues. To many of us here, Dr. Peters was a friend, a colleague, a mentor, and a partner in environmental justice movements in China and Southeast Asia, and an all-around inspiration, for how to live courageously and do very good things in a remarkable life. It was an honor to know her, to use our shared platform to showcase her genius and generosity, and to share in her remembrance of her today. Please feel free to stay with us for 1 minute in silent remembrance, and thank you so much for coming. Stay well.